Welcome to another First Friday event sponsored by the Town of Woodside's Arts and Culture Committee. We're a group of like-minded volunteers who come together and try to find interesting programs for the community. And this evening, I think you'll find it very fascinating. So, Kathy's going to be talking about the formation of Edgewood Park. Edgewood is an important part of our community because it gives members of the community and our visitors an opportunity to explore nature in a natural state. If you haven't been there, I certainly encourage you to go and explore it. Kathy and I were just talking about how walking and being in nature helps renew our souls. It gives us connection to the planet that we live on. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kathy, who's on the board of the committee to save Edgewood Park.
Friends of Edgewood.
Okay, she didn't say that. So, and she'll give her own introduction. So without further ado, here's Kathy. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Tom, for that lovely introduction, and for all of you for letting me speak to you tonight about Edgewood Natural Preserve. Well, I'm not a trained historian. I have been fascinated with Edgewood for over 30 years, and what I'm going to tell you tonight is information that I gleaned and prepared for our docent training. We have docents that lead springtime wildflower walks. I don't know if any of you have been on them, but I do the history module for that training. We're really very lucky that Edgewood is still here. And the story I'm going to tell you tonight is a story about dedication of a lot of individuals, some lucky misses, and some just almost disasters that happened to Edgewood. How many of you have ever been there? Raise your hands. Everybody. Oh, I can just skip right past the map that tells you where it is and go straight to the springtime wildflowers. Now, this is what we would call our super bloom, and this is what we also call the butterfly habitat, and I'll be telling you more about that as the time goes on. What I'd like to do this evening is to discuss what makes Edgewood special, talk about the different landowners that lived on the property through time, talk about a little day camp tour and some of the idiosyncrasies of that area, tell you about the Save Edgewood efforts. Is this working okay, Bill? Okay. And then how those efforts turned into the Friends of Edgewood. And I'm, as Tom was alluding to, I'm on the board of the Friends of Edgewood and have worked with Edgewood and been a volunteer there for 30 years. Talk about some of the more recent threats that are still exist, and then end with an invitation to ask you to come and walk in Edgewood and appreciate it for yourself. So why is it so special? It's the only natural preserve in the San Mateo County Parks system. They have 24 park units, but this is the only natural preserve. That means that we try to leave it as wild as possible while providing some trails for all of us to access and go enjoy nature. It has some really intriguing fault zone topography and geology. You know, we're about a half a mile from the San Andreas Fault, and in fault zones there's often a lot of mixing of different stones that eventually erode into soil, and the moving of the fault zones actually creates hills and valleys. So it's a very small property, less than 3/4 of a square mile or 467 acres, there is a lot of variation. And that leads to remarkable biological diversity. We have those spectacular springtime wildflowers that I showed you. It's home to threatened and endangered species on the endangered species list. There are over 10 miles of trails and some scenic vistas where you can look out to the bay or to the Santa Cruz Mountains. And I like to think of it as a window into California's botanical past. Before, settlers came and brought their own plants with them that forever changed the landscape. And finally, there's a very active and passionate volunteer group, the Friends of Edgewood. Let's start first with the first people that were on the land, the native people. The land that we call now Edgewood was once inhabited or cared for by the native people. I would not say that there was archaeological evidence that they ever lived there as a village, because we don't see any middens or any shell mounds. But this arrow, the spearhead down here, was found in year 2000. It's about 2 inches long. Can you see where I'm marking here? No, it's right underneath that. It's this thing right here, underneath that little sign. It's about 2 inches long, and it was found just a couple of, well, in archaeological times, just a few years ago. A village like the one pictured here on the right was not in Edgewood, because it takes a reliable and sustainable year-round water source. And the ephemeral springs and streams that are in Edgewood would not have been able to support a village. But I'm sure that they moved through for foraging, for acorn gathering, and for hunting. And we have learned that the road that's now called Edgewood Road used to be a foot trail for the native people. The next people to move onto the land were the Spanish and the Mexicans. Those governments ceded land to some of the people that had helped them discover the area. And they established these what are called ranchos, and they were very, very large. And the ranchers then that came were raising cattle. And if you know anything about native grasslands, there tend to be bunches of grass and then plain ground, and then another bunch and some more plain ground. And when you're wanting to raise cattle and have them graze on the land, you want just a sea of grass, not any of these empty spaces. So they brought in grasses that they were more familiar with from their homeland, and those changed the prairies forever. And we're still fighting some of those non-native grasses right now. In 1795, Rancho de las Pulgas, you know the street we know, was established. Now that was 35,000 acres, essentially between the San Mateo and Santa Clara County lines and east of Cañada, so a big, huge rancho. And that was eventually inherited by Maria Soledad de Arguello. She was the granddaughter of Sergeant Ortega, who was part of the Portola expedition that actually discovered the San Francisco Bay. And so as a thank you to Sergeant Ortega for being on part of that expedition, he was granted the land grant, and then it moved down to Maria. The next people that came into this area were those that were logging. And remember, in around mid-1800s, there was a gold boom in California. San Francisco was developing and was trying to support the infrastructure that was needed to support that boom. And so they started logging the Santa Cruz Mountains and bringing logs down. Can you see this? No, that's not showing. You see the oxen trail down there in the lower right-hand corner? Those oxen were used to pull the log sections down the road, and that road was that same footpath that we talked about before. It was called Whipple's Mill Road at that time. It later became Cordilleras Road, and later became Edgewood Road that it is today. And it was subject to landslides. And any of us that have driven on Edgewood Road this last winter know it's still subject to landslides. And we'll find one of the early residents had a funny saying about those muddy roads. To support the loggers, a little town developed near the corner of Cañada Road and Edgewood Road, and it was called West Union. And it was a village unto itself. It had a saloon, it had a store, it had a graveyard, and finally it had a school. The school is pictured here. It was a one-room school, and it The first teacher was Michael Kelly, hired in 1859. The school was built 2 years later for him. If you drive south on Kenyatta Road from Edgewood, there's a historical marker on the right-hand side, and it talks about the school and this little town. The first more modern person to live on the land was John Isaac. And after the land had passed through a number of hands, and it was subdivided and then recollected, he bought a piece of property in 1891. He was a bachelor at the time, but he wanted to build a house for his bride, Edith Penman. So he salvaged materials from the California Midwinter International Exposition that was held in Golden Gate Park in 1894. So that was one of the big, almost like a World's Fair kind of thing. And there was a lot of temporary buildings that were built, and he salvaged all the building materials from that. He'd also previously salvaged tiles from Soledad Mission when it went to ruins, and he bartered with the railroad he would give them those roof tiles if they would move his building materials from San Francisco along in the train down to Redwood City, and then from there he had a horse cart that brought them up, pardon me, to the property area. Pictured here is current day Burlingame Station, which still has those tiles that John Isaac brought down and salvaged from Soledad Mission. Now, John developed the water supply for the house, and there's a spring up in the hills there that still feeds the little waterfall that you may have seen along the Sylvan Trail. Last summer in the drought, that was the first time in 30 years that I ever saw that stream completely dry up. This is the house that John built. This is looking up towards the end of the picnic area, and you can see if you look here next to the house, you see that tree. That's the redwood tree that now is about 200 feet tall. And John Isaac worked for the California Horticultural Commission, and he was instrumental in developing a wasp that would be parasitic on moths that were ruining the state's apple crop. And he wrote this little book, Bug versus Bug, that talked about how he had developed these. And his wife, Edith, did all the illustrations for the book. Later on, remind me to tell you about another Bug versus Bug in the later history of Edgewood. Now, Isaac commuted to San Francisco, so you can imagine living up in Edgewood and having every day his wife would take him by buggy down to the train station. He'd get on the train and go up to San Francisco. But in the wintertime, he was said to have said that Edgewood Road, then it was called Whipple's Mill Road, was not passable. It wasn't even jackassable. And so he wound up living in San Francisco during the wintertime because he just couldn't get back and forth. Here's another picture of the house sort of from the other direction. The next tenant in this, now it's a house, not just property that we were talking about, was Henry Finkler. Now, he was a real character, as you can see from the way he's dressed. He bought the house in 1908, and he was a champion big wheel bicycle rider, and he even patented a brake for those bikes. Heretofore, I think you just had to sort of grab on with your gloved hands to stop them. His wife, Eileen, was prominent in the Red Cross, and it was considered a coup to be invited up to the Finklers' house to have dinner up in the big house up on the hill. Finkler was also an avid and meticulous weather watcher and statistics keeper, and his statistics actually help support the phrase climate best by government test that's over the Broadway in Redwood City and on a number of the Welcome to Redwood City signs. And he also filed a couple of name claims, Baywood Glen and Inspiration Heights. Here's a picture of those claims and also just a brief picture of the roller brake patent that he had. Now, he was secretary to the state Supreme Court, and he, in air quotes, inherited that job from his father, which is kind of unusual, I would think. And he and his wife had plans to subdivide Edgewood. In fact, they had plans on their dining room table when she suddenly took sick and passed away. That was in 1927. 3 years later, Mr. Finkler was still so distraught over losing his wife that he committed suicide behind the barn on his house. And it was a planned suicide. He invited a friend, the undertaker from Redwood City, and the undertaker brought another friend up, and they were essentially right there when he committed suicide. His will was in his hat band, and it left the estate to a friend and a state Supreme Court clerk. Excuse me. Now, the Finklers had no children, but they did have cousins and aunts and uncles and relatives who challenged the hand-drawn will, but the original intent of the will prevailed, in part because of a friendly judge that Mr. Finkler had worked with in the Supreme Court. Now, this is the grounds when the Finklers owned the house. You can see where that arrow is. That's where the redwood tree is, and it's growing up a little bit more. And that little white triangle off to the right, that's a one-horse barn that Finkler had. All of the people that lived on the property were gentleman farmers, if you will. They weren't trying to raise crops or animals to sell. They were just for their own use. So they had garden areas and livestock areas that were penned in. This is another view of the Finkler house a little bit closer up. Now, as I said, he left his property to a friend and a Supreme Court clerk, and that clerk was Benjamin Grant Taylor. He bought out the other person, Michael Purcell, and the Taylors moved onto the property. They also ran in sort of the upper crust circles and were also affiliated with the Red Cross. They lived on the property from 1943 to 1967 when the state took over by eminent domain. Trish, who was Benjamin Grant Taylor's granddaughter and one of our Friends of Edgewood friends, tells delightful stories, as she calls it, running wild on the property. Here's a picture of the Taylors. That's Benjamin Grant Taylor, the grandfather, on the left. The taller woman on the right-hand side of that first picture is his daughter, Betty Lou, which was Trish's mother. And this is a picture of the house, I don't know, from the car, maybe 1940s-ish. And you can see the redwood trees growing up. Now, when the Taylors lived on the property, Trish is delightful because she was willing to walk around the property with me and show me various places. And she said when they came up that big circular driveway that goes all the way up around to the picnic areas, that they had a wrought iron gate over the top that said Taylor's Place. And that was sort of the welcoming, and they called the area Baywood Glen. That was one of the names, remember, that Finkler had got essentially copywritten. As you go up that trail, so we're just headed under the wrought iron and back to the back, when the Taylors lived on the property, there was a rental unit back there. It had a 4-car garage because her uncle George, who lived with them, loved cars, including he had a Willis Jeep. This was a rental unit. You can see the door on the left side. Behind that is a spiral staircase that goes up to the top. All the way across the front is a screened-in porch. There was a living room, a kitchen in the front, and in the back a bathroom and a bedroom. It was designed by William Wilson Webster, who supposedly is a famous architect and was also a family member. One of the other eccentric things that perhaps Mr. Finkler did was to put in a cement bowling alley in the back of the picnic area. And Trish's mother, Betty Lou, raised show dogs, schnauzers, and she worked them there, you know, how they're supposed to walk all prissy and with their little leashes up. Well, she exercised them in that area. So now we've gone to up the driveway, around the corner, and now we're going to start back towards the entrance area. The next thing that you come to, tucked up behind on a little platform, you'll find these old stairs. You can see the stairs next to behind where the girls are. Those stairs are still visible. And there was a little one-room or one-bedroom cottage there that Trish's family called the nurse's house because they rented it to a nurse. And she'll play a prominent role a little bit later. So just to keep you oriented, this is the cement bathroom that's up there, cement block bathroom. That's where the house was. So just so if you're wondering when I'm doing all my crazy pointing. So another quirk of Mr. Finkler, this is a more recent picture, but it shows better that there was these little tiny windows at the top of the house. And those were to allow light into the attic space. And Finkler was rumored to be building an airplane in the attic. Now, a couple problems with that. The only access to the attic was through a set of those pull-down stairs that was in an upstairs bathroom, so you had to pull those down to get up. And then once you get a plane built in an attic, how do you get it out? But that was just one of the many quirky things about Mr. Finkler. Now, the house got removed, and I'll tell you when that was later on. But right now, if you go there, you'll see our Friends of Edgewood farms, where we're trying to enhance some of the native plants. But you see that orange line there? That was where there was a cistern and a reservoir. The reservoir was about 10 by 15. It was a cement square with rebar sticking up. And then next to that was a 6 by 6 covered cistern that was fed by the spring that provided the drinking water for the house. The reservoir was used to water the plants and to water the animals. So one day, their calf, Clover, didn't come home for dinner. And they mounted a search party to try to find Clover, and they could not find her anywhere. They finally found her hanging by her halter in the reservoir. So she was down in the water, and luckily the halter held her head up so she didn't drown, and she could breathe. And so they finally found her, and Trish's Uncle George climbed down into the reservoir. Now you can imagine it's an open pit, so it's got algae, it's got plants, it's got mud, it's got gunk. He's down in there trying to get behind that calf and push her up out of the reservoir. And the kids are pulling on the halter and getting her up. And they finally got her out, saved her. But she was shocky. She was shaking because she'd been in the water for a long time. She was scared. She was cold. So they went and got the nurse. And the nurse said, well, let me see what I can do. Covered her up, took her back to her house that had a heater in it. And by the next morning, Clover was fine. And it was a story that they told over and over and over. So let's move now more towards the land itself. And this is an aerial view of, as it says, 1948. So you'll notice the intersection here of Kenyatta Road and going up at the angle, that's Edgewood Road. But you notice that I-280 is not there. Of course, in 1948, wasn't there. And that little darker square, that's the eucalyptus trees that are now kind of up and tucked around where the freeway crosses over Kenyatta Road. That's one of the two places that I learned where the school might be. The other one might have been where the PG&E substation is now. But let's fast forward to today, well, 2 years ago, and this is what it looks like now. You can see how I-280 is coming through there. It's cut off this triangular piece of property. That's important because that whole area is called the butterfly habitat, that sort of reddish brown that's through there. And when it got cut off, that helped, made a big problem for the butterflies, let's put it that way. You can see some sort of lighter patches in the middle of that red. That's where some mowing has been done, and I'll tell you about that a little bit later. And then you can see down here in the lower, about in the middle, is where the PG&E substation is now. So let's talk about how some of the lucky things and some of the near misses that Edgewood went through. In the 1960s, there was a real estate developer that wanted to turn it all into homes. Remember, the Finklers had wanted to do that too, but her death precluded that. In 1967, then the state took it over by eminent domain because they wanted to build Edgewood Hills State College. They were going to build it on the western side of Edgewood. They were going to tear down Finklers' house and put in dormitories in that area. The state finally abandoned that project about 3 years after they took over the property. And then the federal government had a brilliant idea. Why don't we put a solar research facility on all this beautiful grassland? Because it's sunny there all the time, and it'd just be a wonderful place to try that out. Luckily, the San Mateo County supervisors rejected that plan. The next owner of the property was the county of San Mateo, and they went into a deal to buy the property for $2 million. And if you think now, a vacant lot up in Emerald Hills probably costs close to that, and here we've got 467 acres. They bought the property with 50% from the federal government, 25% from Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District, and 25% from the county itself. And they had the idea that they wanted to put a golf course on what's now Edgewood. And the map here is showing where the golf course was going to be. Those are the layout of where the fairways and holes would have been. They hired a very famous architect. It's said that the sun never sets. The sun is always shining on a Robert Trent Jones golf course all the way around the world because he had done so many of them. And this was going to be an 18-holer. You were going to come in under the freeway and drive in under there and come in along the road. But while it was in limbo when they were trying to figure out whether or not they were going to be able to do the golf course, there was no really perimeter fencing and no signage, and so people kind of abused the land at that time. Well, while all that was going on, a woman named Suzanne Summers lived nearby, and she just went through the area and documented all of the flowers and plants that she saw. And she realized that it was a site of rare species diversity and even some rare and rarely seen plants. And she spoke to just about anybody that would listen, especially anybody with any political clout, about the value of saving Edgewood so that its plant communities and the ecosystems could persist. A coalition of about 40 different groups and individuals besides that fought to save the golf course, save it from becoming a golf course. And Carolyn Curtis left her full-time job to lead the political effort to fight it from becoming a golf course. Then in the 1980s, the California Native Plant Society filed a suit to stop the progress because there were rare and endangered species on the property, and a golf course with its extra watering and all its fertilizers and all of its people and all of the tools and everything that would have to be there would have threatened those plants. But the real kicker was in 1987, the bay checker spot butterfly was placed on the endangered species list as a threatened species. And so it seemed easier for people to get behind saving a charismatic little critter than they could get behind necessarily saving a rare plant that maybe they had never even seen. Another lucky thing was that the composition of the Board of Supervisors changed over. Two new people, pictured here, the two men, Ruben Bareilles and Ted Limpert, came onto the board, and they were much more ecologically minded than the board composition of the board before that. And in 1993, they declared Edgewood as a natural preserve in perpetuity. And so then it was, yay, we've saved it. So the Friends of Edgewood was formed from some of the active people that were instrumental in trying to save it. This year we are celebrating our 30th anniversary with some special events for our volunteers and our supporters. And we have been called the best little volunteer group on the peninsula. I like to say that. So the Friends of Edgewood is an all-volunteer. We have no paid staff at all. It's a not-for-profit organization, and we probably have more than 100 active volunteers that offer their time and their talents and their treasury to doing these 40 different projects. That's not meant to be an eye test for you. It's just to show you all the different things that we're involved in. And in 2022, we devoted over 13,600 hours to the betterment of Edgewood. In people years, that's almost 7 people years worth of work that was volunteered for Edgewood. The kinds of things that we do, year-round staffing of the education center, that's over on the main entrance off of Edgewood Road. We do lead the springtime docent-led wildflower walks that are free. We are trying to maintain our year-round third Saturday nature hikes. Some of these things got jeopardized with COVID because we had to shut down and we couldn't do the things that we usually did. We do adopt a highway along the Edgewood Preserve so that the view into the preserve isn't marred by a bunch of trash on the freeway. We recruit people and money to support the weeding efforts and Project 467, which I'll tell you about in a minute. We have people that go out and do checker spotting to see if they can find the bay checker spot butterflies and check the bluebird boxes. There are 26 of those. So they go look at them every week to see how many eggs have been laid, how many chicks have fledged. And we also have special activities that we have from time to time, like Defy Extinction and night hikes. One of the biggest things we do is fighting weeds. Weeds take advantage of any disturbed soil. So, in your own garden, you make it all nice for the flowers that you plant, and then the weeds come and want to share the space with them. Pictured here is Ellie Hess. She's going like this, about teasel, which is a plant that was brought in from the East Coast that people used to card wool. You take these little prickly heads and it can be used to card wool, so that's why it was brought initially, but it just spreads itself. She started a program in 1989 to go after teasel. Today there's still a weeding program that has over 60 active volunteers. They come out at least once a week, and during the summertime, during daylight savings times, they come out on Wednesday nights as well. We have learned over time that well-timed mowing and many volunteer hours eliminated most of yellow star thistle. I think those of you know what that is in this area, and I'm sure you're seeing that it's come back this year after all that rain. So we in Edgewood we have people that roam when they do their weeding, and they look for that little yellow head and pull it out before it gets bad again. The largest threat we have right now are the non-native grasses that were imported by those ranchers in the Mexican and Spanish land grants, that they're still here and persist today. We have experimented with things like tarping, HMP, which I'll tell you about in a minute, graminicide, which is a herbicide that focuses on grasses. We even tried goats one time. We tried dethatching, and there was an accidental small fire, but we have found no magic bullet yet. We have an experiment going now that I'll tell you about in a minute that we're hopeful. Remember I said that weeds love disturbance. This silver stripe through this picture is a PG&E gas line, and right on top of it is yellow star thistle. So you can see that where the land was disturbed to dig up and put in that pipeline, that's where the weeds came in, and that's where they have stayed. These are yellow star thistle skeletons. And in 1999, we had an El Nino year, and we had a monoculture of yellow star thistle in the center of the park. This is me sitting in it, and you can see it's taller than my head sitting down. So there was a lot of it. So we've now tried to focus on the entire preserve, and we started what we called Project 467, protecting every single acre. And it's an umbrella project that includes that weeding program that I was telling you about, talks about a butterfly restoration program, thorn mint and panakita protection, and then a green grass initiative. The idea of green grass is to restore Edgewood's fertile grasslands to their former floral beauty. Remember that window into California's botanical past, to try to make it look like that again, by reducing or eliminating the weeds and promoting greater cover of the native plants. One of the ways we're doing that, and this is the experiment that we're running now, is what's called hydromechanical pulverization. That means that you take a high-pressure hose like this with a very fine nozzle and whack off those little grass shoots just when they come up about this big so that they won't have a chance to grow big. The problem with grass is that it grows early, it grows fast, and it grows tall. So it takes the soil nutrient, it takes the space, it takes the water, and it takes the sunlight away from the other plants that are oftentimes the native plants that are shorter stature. And then we are trying to increase native seeds in our seed beds here to be able to put that back after we've knocked out the grass. I said that under that Project 467 umbrella is the thorn mint and panakita projects. Thorn mint is really a special story. Thorn mint is a little tiny mint. It's about this big. And in 2008, there were only 250 plants left in the entire world, and they were in Edgewood, in an area of special soil, clay soil, deep cracks, special hydrology underneath, and the hydrology was changing, and there was less and less every year. So we worked with the scientists from Creekside Science, and they got a permit to be able to take some of the seeds from the plant and to send them to Berkeley for amplification, brought them back, planted them, collected them again, did the same thing, and we're still doing that. So that was in 2008. Last year, in 2022, there are now 65,000 plants, so we went from 250, declining 250 to 65,000, and they're in multiple locations in Edgewood and even another location outside of Edgewood, so that we don't have a risk of, one failure would take everything out. So really, this is a story of defying extinction. They were on their way to that end, and we were able to bring them back. We're hoping to do the same thing with the little plant next door to that. That's called white-rayed penniquita. There are a lot of these in the triangle and in the watershed area, but they used to thrive in Edgewood as well, and we're trying to do a seed application of those and bring them back so that they'll be back in Edgewood. Now let me tell you about the bay checker spot butterfly. As I said, it was because it got named put on the endangered species list in 1987. That became our poster child for saving Edgewood. In 1997, there were Stuart Weiss, the same Creekside scientist, counted 9,000 larvae, and he goes out and he picks them up. They're little black things about this long. He counts how many he finds, but by 2002, he only saw one. So he thought, oh my gosh, what's happening to these bay checker spot butterflies? They used to be on both sides, that triangle piece that was cut off, our side, and they were also in Jasper Ridge, but the population was declining. And he developed a theory as to what was happening. The butterflies lived in an area that had the underlying serpentine soil. And serpentine is usually associated with earthquake faults. It's very low in nitrogen and higher in some heavy metals. And you know, when you buy fertilizer, N, that big N on the bag, is telling you how much nitrogen is in it. This soil is very low in nitrogen. And Stuart figured out that all of the cars driving by on 280 and their catalytic converters were spewing out NOx, NOx, and that N was that same nitrogen. So essentially, the soil that had kept the native plants there because they'd adapted to it over the millennia was suddenly being fertilized, and it was allowing the weeds to come in because they were taking advantage of that fertilizer that was coming from the cars driving by. We did learn that rotational mowing and mowing more often closer to the freeway helped keep that down so that we could make the ground ready for trying to bring back the butterflies. The numbers are not self-sustaining yet. We hope that they will be. You sort of need a Goldilocks climate. You know, insects are bloom or bust, and it's hard in a small area like this for an insect to be able to sustain itself. Let's talk about some of the assaults on Edgewood. We've already mentioned weeds. We already mentioned that the freeway cut off a big chunk of it. But in the 60s and 70s, when it wasn't fenced properly, there were off-road vehicles that just went up and down that central hill. And you can still see the evidence of those off-road vehicles, that damage that was caused way back then. People used it as a dumping ground. I've seen cars, refrigerators, stoves, piles of garden trash, all kinds of things that people used to dump in there because they didn't know any better. There's also a gas pipeline that I'll tell you about in a second. And I think the uninformed public still goes off trail, picks wildflowers and picnics in it. And because it's a natural preserve, we try to do as little disturbance as possible to let the plants and the animals live as naturally as they can, because it is a refugia for many animals and some of these rare and endangered plants. Now, the PG&E pipeline is a story unto itself. There are two. Those blue lines show where the gas pipeline runs through Edgewood. And if you'll notice, it's running right next to what I named before as the butterfly habitat. So it's a little scary that that's where it is. And of course, after the San Bruno incident, there were huge safety concerns raised. And so PG&E has done some things. They've put in a new elbow, they pressure tested, they keep doing repairs, and they have removed vegetation from on top of the pipeline so they can walk along the course of the pipeline with their sniffers to make sure that it's not leaking. And that's the sort of place where we are right now. They may still try to replace it at some point, and we would probably fight that. And you say, well, gee, it's a safety concern. Why would you fight it? Well, this is why. They say that they need an 80-foot wide workspace that would go right across the preserve and right next to the butterfly habitat. So to have all this going on right next to that, and that beautiful picture that I showed you to start with, that would be right along the edge of this. And it would hurt our hearts if that were ever to happen. This is some of the fuel reduction that PG&E has done. And then during COVID, a number of people that weren't used to being in parks and preserves and didn't really know how to behave started some social trails. That means not using the sanctioned trails, but going from point A to point B just because that's where they wanted to go. And we got worried that that was going to continue to be an avenue, and these social trails would get institutionalized and they'd be there forever. So we did a project and went around to document all of them, found 100 of these social trails that were not where they were supposed to be at all. And what we did was rake some thatch and put up sticks and twigs and over the entrances of them. And I'm happy to say that as we go by now, some of them have already disappeared completely just by keeping the foot traffic off of them and this nature's healing itself. These are some of the key individuals that have been in Edgewood's history. I've talked about Suzanne Summers and Carolyn Curtis. Tony Corelli wrote a book about the flora of Edgewood. Julia Bott raised the money and was the shepherdess for the education center getting built. Ellie House I talked about already. Ken Himes is a naturalist extraordinaire, and Carol Hankermeyer started a junior explorer program. And we have every year a best friend that we name from our group that's done something in the betterment of Edgewood. So here we are, dedication by a lot of people that spent their time, a lot of luck, a lot of near misses. Mrs. Finkler's death halted the subdivision. The state couldn't get their act together when they wanted to build a college. The solar farm fell through. The trail was abused by the locals, and then the county wanted to put in a golf course and cover up all of this beautiful habitat. But the bay checker spot butterfly helped save that. And when the yellow star thistle started to invade, our weeders rolled up their sleeves and pretty much have eliminated it from Edgewood. And then we had our Save Edgewood Park Coalition that became the Friends of Edgewood. Edgewood is still being protected today by the dedication of the Friends of Edgewood. Our mission is to protect Edgewood's extraordinary biodiversity and foster lasting connections with Edgewood and the larger community and the natural world. We want to invite people to come to it. And I would invite you to come for a walk and see some of the beautiful wildflowers that are there this next spring. April is a great month to come and take a good walk. Thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any. Go to friendsofedgewood.org. That's our website. You can see all of the different things that we're involved with, all of the things that are happening in Edgewood. And if you'd like to donate to support our efforts, we would be happy to have that happen.
Okay, thank you again.
Thank you.
Now, before you go, I want to remind you that next month we continue with conservation theme. We have Jim coming from Paoli who will be talking about how they deal with sustainability. Now, that program is going to be a tape program because Jim was not going to be able to be here live. So you can come and it'll be on the big screen and you'll be able to enjoy his presentation at that time. Otherwise, thank you very much. Take care of yourselves. And remember, as Shakespeare said, nature is our kin. So we want to take care of it. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you.